Paris syndrome is a psychological condition experienced almost exclusively by Japanese tourists who are disappointed when the City of Lights does not live up to their romantic expectations. The syndrome, which is considered an extreme case of culture shock, causes symptoms such as an acute delusional state, hallucinations, anxiety, dizziness, and sweating. It has been documented by medical journals, with the condition first being diagnosed by Hiroaki Ota in 1986, who somewhat ironically was a Japanese psychiatrist working in France. One French psychiatric journal cites the disappointment many visitors feel is caused by the over-romanticized expectations of Paris as the city of love, fashion, and glamorous. The illness seems to have taken its place as the 21st century version of gout that is a slightly too privileged a problem to sympathize with. Yet for those who succumb to it, Paris syndrome and its after effects are very real. Sufferers have reported being traumatized by the experience and feel that they could never travel again because of it. The city of Paris is a popular tourist destination due to Japan's fascination with all things French. Cities such as Tokyo are filled with French pastieries and luxury French fashion outlets. Indeed, France is a favorite destination for the Japanese. The statistics say that between 1 million to 6 million Japanese people visit France each year. Perhaps it's because these two countries have such diametrically opposed cultures. For instance, France is extremely liberated compared to Japan's traditional and conservative society. In Japanese culture and media, Paris is basically depicted to be the stuff of fairy tales. Hence, the iconic romantic city unfailingly piques the interests of the Japanese tourist. However, once the Japanese tourists get there, reality hits them. The weather in Paris is almost as bad as England's rainy reputation. There are often strikes, people smoking cigarettes are everywhere, and professional pickpockets can smell naive tourists from miles away. In fact, the metro in Paris often reminds tourists to watch their belongings in different languages, one of those languages being Japanese. Another instance of the diametric opposition between Japan and France, or at least Japan and Paris, is that Japan is famously clean even down to its most populated areas. Japan has a reputation as people who are exceedingly polite, and France perhaps has a slightly different reputation. And this difference in expectations is a culture shock. Another reason which may contribute to the culture shock is the language barrier and the general reluctance of locals to engage with the tourist's attempt at communicating. Sufferers of Paris syndrome have been known to get a persecution complex, believing themselves to be the victim of prejudice or hostility from the Parisians. Meanwhile, Parisians generally treat everybody like that. Thus, when the reality of the modern city of Paris sets in with its notoriously rude service and confusing public transport system, some tourists simply cannot cope with their expectations being so hopelessly and utterly dashed. Again, these differences are exacerbated by culture. An encounter with a rude taxi driver or Parisian waiter who shouts at customers who cannot speak fluent French might be laughed off from those by other Western cultures, who perhaps have a more realistic view of what they will be getting when they go to Paris. But for the Japanese, who are used to a more polite and helpful society in which voices are rarely raised in anger, the experience of their dream city, Paris, can easily turn into a nightmare which is simply too much. With exhaustion, language barriers, culture barriers, general homesickness, and culture shock can cause serious psychological distress. Up to 12 Japanese tourists a year fall victim to it, and these victims are primarily women in their 30s with high expectations of what may be their first trip abroad. The situation is so serious that the Japanese embassy runs a 24-hour helpline for expatriates and tourists who begin to experience the syndrome. Indeed, the problem appears to be getting worse instead of improving, as there have been reports now of Chinese and South Korean tourists also experiencing Paris syndrome. Many of these tourists are the burgeoning middle class in these countries, who are traveling for the first time. The only known solution to cure Paris syndrome is to leave Paris. And that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, hope you found it interesting, and drop a like, comment and subscribe if you feel like it. Until next time.